In the spring of 1992, a country that had existed for 74 years simply stopped answering to its own name. Snipers took positions on the hills above Sarajevo, and a nation that once fielded Olympic teams and hosted world leaders began tearing itself into pieces. By the time the dust settled, one country had become seven: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and eventually Kosovo. But what if it hadn't happened that way? What if the federation had held, and instead of seven small states scattered across the Balkans, there was still just one, sitting at the crossroads of Central Europe, the Mediterranean, and the East? To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was actually built. Yugoslavia wasn't some accident of Cold War map drawing, it was a deliberate federation, stitched together first as a kingdom in 1918, then rebuilt after World War II under Josip Broz Tito as a socialist federal republic. 6 republics, 2 autonomous provinces, 6 official nations, and a leader who somehow kept the whole thing balanced for 35 years without leaning on Moscow or Washington. At its peak in 1991, this single federation held roughly 23.5 million people, more than the Netherlands has within its borders today, all inside one Balkan state. Here's the thing people forget: Yugoslavia wasn't some fragile experiment on the verge of collapse. Through the 1960s and 70s, it had its own path, not aligned with the Soviets, not fully Western either, and its passport let citizens travel more freely than almost anyone else behind the old Iron Curtain. But the thing holding it together wasn't an idea, it was one man, and in May 1980, that man died. What followed was a decade of exactly the kind of slow-motion crisis that breaks federations. Hyperinflation cracking 1980s Yugoslavia's economy, foreign debt spiraling, and republic leaders discovering that nationalist rhetoric won elections faster than shared Yugoslav identity ever had. So the breakup wasn't inevitable in some ancient, unavoidable sense. It was the product of a very specific decade of bad decisions layered on top of very real, very old ethnic fault lines. That distinction matters for what comes next. So let's actually build the alternate version. A Yugoslavia that survived the 1990s the way, say, Spain survived its own regional tensions, bruised, decentralized, but intact. Add up the 7 successor states today, and you get a population of roughly 19.5 million lower than 1991, mostly because of war deaths, emigration, and one of the lowest birth rates in Europe. A united Yugoslavia today would land in the same range as Romania or Kazakhstan, somewhere in the low to mid-60s among the world's most populous countries. Land-wise, adding up all 7 successor states gives about 256,000 square kilometers, close to the size of the United Kingdom and larger than Romania. Now stack the economies. Add together the current GDPs of all 7 successor states, and you land somewhere around $250 billion. That's not nothing, but split 7 ways, most of these economies stay small, isolated, and dependent on remittances and EU aid. United, that combined GDP would put Yugoslavia roughly on par with Portugal or Greece, a mid-sized European economy with real leverage in Brussels, instead of 7 small players, each negotiating from the back of the room. But raw GDP hides the real story, which is the coastline. A united Yugoslavia would control almost the entire eastern Adriatic, the ports, the islands, the tourist economy that today is split awkwardly between Slovenia's tiny stretch at Koper, Croatia's long coastline, Montenegro's bay towns, and Bosnia's narrow 20-kilometer sliver at Neum. One government controlling Dubrovnik, Split, Kotor, and the Dalmatian coast as a single tourism strategy, instead of 4 competing national ones that alone could be worth billions in unrealized coordinated development. Militarily, the old Yugoslav People's Army was once the 3rd largest force in Europe outside the Soviet bloc, built specifically to make invading the country an unappealing idea for anyone, East or West. Today, the combined active militaries of all 7 successor states add up to roughly 71,000 personnel, still a fraction of what once made Yugoslavia untouchable, but spread across 7 separate command structures instead of 1. And here's where the premise gets complicated, because a bigger, unified Yugoslavia wouldn't automatically mean a happier one. The same ethnic and religious divisions that fueled the 1990s wars, Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Bosnian Muslims, Albanian Kosovars, don't disappear just because the borders don't move. A surviving Yugoslavia would still have needed some real answer to Kosovo, where ethnic Albanians made up roughly 90% of the population by the 1990s, but had no republic of their own. Attention that boiled over into open war in 1998, regardless of what else was happening around it. So maybe the honest version of this alternate timeline isn't one smooth federation. It's a Yugoslavia that survives by becoming something looser, more like a Balkan version of the European Union. Shared currency and defense, but real autonomy for republics like Slovenia and Kosovo that wanted out from under Belgrade's thumb. That version might have avoided the worst of it. Estimates put the total death toll of the Yugoslav wars at somewhere between 130,000 and 140,000 people, with millions more displaced from their homes across Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo. That's the real cost hiding underneath every population and GDP chart in this video. Every stat we've compared: the smaller economy, the shrunken military, the divided coastline, traces back to that decade of war, not just to 7 governments choosing to go their separate ways. There's also a language angle worth pausing on. Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin are so mutually intelligible that linguists still argue over whether they're really 4 languages or 1, split for political reasons, Serbo-Croatian in different clothes. Which raises an odd point. Culturally, the ingredients for unity never actually left. It's the politics on top of them that fractured. Today, Slovenia and Croatia sit inside the European Union. Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Kosovo are still stuck in accession limbo, negotiating individually for a seat that a united Yugoslavia might have walked into decades ago as a single, mid-sized member state. So would a Yugoslavia that never broke apart be bigger, richer, and stronger today? Almost certainly. But it would only have gotten there by solving the exact problem it never solved the first time around: how to let 7 very different nations share one flag without any one of them holding the knife.